Good evening and welcome to the Sleeping Zoo. Facts to fall asleep to. The history of the walrus begins not in the frozen expanses of the modern Arctic, but in the temperate waters of the North Pacific, roughly 15 million years ago. To understand the creature we see today, we must look back to the Miocene epoch, a time when the ancestors of modern pinnipedomorphs began to diverge into the distinct lineages of seals, sea lions, and the walrus. While the world is familiar with the otariids, or eared seals, and the phocids, or earless seals, the walrus occupies a lonely and singular branch of the tree of life, as the only living member of the family Odobenidae. This taxonomic isolation is a testament to a highly specialized evolutionary path that saw dozens of related species vanish over millions of years, leaving only Odobenus rosmarus to carry the legacy of the tusk-footed giants. These ancient ancestors were once far more diverse, with some possessing shorter tusks and others lacking them entirely. Yet they all shared a drive toward a benthic existence that would eventually define the species. The physical presence of a bull walrus is an exercise in biological excess, a massive muscle and fat that can exceed 2,000 kilograms in the Pacific subspecies, and roughly half that for the slightly smaller Atlantic variety. Their skin is a topographical map of a hard life, thick and rugged, reaching depths of nearly 10 inches around the neck of a dominant male. This hide serves as a suit of armor against the jagged edges of pack ice and the territorial strikes of rivals. Beneath this exterior lies a layer of blubber that acts as both a primary energy reserve and a critical insulator against the heat-leaching properties of the Arctic Ocean. This blubber can account for up to 1/3 of the animal's total body mass, providing enough buoyancy to help these heavy mammals float while they sleep at the surface, and enough calories to sustain them during the long migrations between feeding grounds and seasonal ice. Perhaps the most iconic feature of the walrus is the pair of elongated upper canine teeth known as tusks. Unlike the horns of a rhino or the antlers of a deer, these are living, growing teeth that emerge throughout the animal's life, sometimes reaching a length of 1 meter in older males. The growth of these tusks is a slow and steady process, with the ivory being deposited in layers that can actually be studied by scientists to determine the age and health history of the individual. While they are often depicted as weapons, and indeed they are used with lethal intent during the mating season to defend a position on the ice, their most frequent use is far more utilitarian. The walrus uses these tusks as specialized ice picks, hooking them into the frozen crust to pull its massive bulk out of the water. This behavior, observed for centuries by Arctic explorers, led to the genus name Odobenus, which literally translates from the Greek as toothwalker. Beyond their use in mobility, the tusks are the primary indicators of social status. Within a haul out of hundreds of animals, a walrus with longer, more symmetrical tusks rarely has to fight for a prime spot. Its mere presence is often enough to intimidate smaller rivals. If a challenger does arise, the confrontation usually begins with a visual display where the animals turn their heads to showcase the girth and length of their ivory. If this does not settle the dispute, they engage in a violent chest-to-chest strike, using their massive neck muscles to drive the tusks into the thick skin of their opponent. These battles leave behind a lattice of scars and nodules that signify a male's experience in dominance within the herd hierarchy. Even the females possess tusks, though theirs are typically more slender and curved, serving similar roles in protection and ice navigation. While the tusks capture the human imagination, the true engine of the walrus's survival is located on its snout. The walrus is a highly specialized suction feeder, and to find its prey in the silty, pitch-black depths of the seafloor, it relies on an array of 400 to 700 stiff, straw-like bristles called vibrissae. These are not merely hairs, but sophisticated sensory organs, each one connected to a complex network of nerves and blood vessels that transmit tactile data directly to the brain. The sensitivity of these whiskers is extraordinary, comparable to the dexterity of human fingertips. In the absolute darkness of the benthic zone, perhaps 80 meters below the surface, the walrus uses its vibrissae to distinguish between a small pebble and a succulent clam with a single touch. This allows them to systematically sweep the seafloor, identifying and isolating bivalves from the surrounding sediment with surgical precision. The foraging process of a walrus is a masterclass in hydraulic engineering. Once a clam or mussel is identified by the whiskers, the walrus does not use its teeth to crush the shell. Instead, it uses its powerful tongue and a uniquely shaped vaulted palate to create a vacuum. By retracting its tongue rapidly toward the back of its throat, the walrus generates enough negative pressure to suck the soft body of the mollusk right out of its shell, leaving the empty casing behind on the seafloor. This method is so efficient that a single walrus can consume up to 6,000 clams in a single feeding session, which may last for several hours. Because they consume such vast quantities of benthic organisms, they act as ecosystem engineers, as they furrow through the mud with their snouts and flippers. They oxygenate the sediment and release trapped nutrients back into the water column, stimulating the growth of phytoplankton and supporting a diverse array of smaller marine life. Thermal regulation in such an extreme environment requires a dynamic physiological response that changes the very appearance of the animal. When a walrus is swimming in the sub-zero waters of the Bering or Chukchi seas, it undergoes intense peripheral vasoconstriction. This process pulls the blood away from the skin and toward the core organs to prevent heat loss, leaving the animal looking a ghostly, pale gray, or even white. However, when the walrus hauls out onto the ice or a rocky beach to bask in the sun, the process reverses. The blood vessels in the skin dilate to absorb the solar radiation and dissipate the heat generated by its internal metabolism. This causes the walrus to turn a deep, vibrant shade of pink or cinnamon red. This pink walrus phenomenon is a visual indicator of a resting animal successfully recharging its thermal batteries before the next deep-sea dive. To facilitate these long dives, the walrus has evolved a blood chemistry that is vastly different from terrestrial mammals. Their bodies contain a much higher concentration of hemoglobin and myoglobin, the proteins responsible for carrying oxygen in the blood and storing it in the muscles. This allows them to stay submerged for nearly half an hour at a time, though they typically surface every 10 minutes to breathe. During these dives, their heart rate slows significantly, a condition known as bradycardia, which further conserves their oxygen supply. They also possess large pharyngeal pouches, like two inflatable sacs located on either side of the esophagus. These pouches can hold up to 50 liters of air and serve multiple functions. They can act as flotation devices that allow the walrus to sleep vertically in the water with its head bobbing above the waves. And they are also used by males to produce the resonant, bell-like vocalizations that define the Arctic soundscape during the breeding season. The social existence of the walrus is defined by an almost claustrophobic proximity, a life lived in a state of constant physical contact known as thigmotaxis. When these animals transition from the solitary depths of the foraging grounds to the terrestrial or ice-based haul-outs, they do not spread out across the available space. Instead, they huddle together in massive, steaming piles of flesh that can number in the thousands. This behavior serves a dual purpose, acting as a collective thermal blanket to conserve body heat against the biting Arctic winds, while also providing a communal defense against their primary natural predators, the polar bear and the orca. Within these dense aggregations, there is a constant, shifting movement as individuals jostle for position, climbing over one another with a surprising degree of agility for creatures that appear so cumbersome on land. This physical intimacy creates a unique sensory environment, where the scent of musk, the sound of rhythmic breathing, and the warmth of neighboring bodies form the foundation of their social reality. The internal logic of these herds is governed by a strict hierarchy that is constantly reinforced through vocalizations and physical posturing. The bellows of a walrus are not merely noise. They are a sophisticated form of communication that carries vital information about an individual's size, intent, and reproductive status. During the winter months, when the pack ice expands and the mating season begins, the acoustic environment of the Arctic transforms into a surreal underwater orchestra. Submerged males perform in what biologists describe as a lekking system, staking out underwater territories near holes in the ice where females are likely to pass. Here, they utilize their pharyngeal pouches to produce a series of clicks, knocks, and resonant, metallic clangs that sound like a hammer striking an anvil or a distant church bell. These songs can last for hours, and the depth and frequency of the tones provide a clear signal to females about the physical fitness and lung capacity of the suitor. This acoustic complexity is matched by the depth of the walrus presence in the human story, particularly within the cosmology of the Arctic's indigenous peoples. For the Inuit, Yupik, and Chukchi, the walrus is not merely a resource, but a powerful spiritual entity that demands respect and ritual. In these cultures, the distinction between the human and animal worlds is often fluid, bridged by the figure of the shaman and the master of the walrus, a spirit that governs the movement of the herds and the success of the hunt. To harvest a walrus was to enter into a sacred contract. Every part of the animal was utilized with a degree of efficiency that modern industry can only envy. The hide became the waterproof covering for the umiak, the large skin boats used for whaling. The blubber provided light and heat in the form of oil for the quillik. And the meat was the primary protein that allowed human life to persist in a landscape where agriculture was impossible. At the center of this relationship is the ivory, a material that occupies a space between the functional and the divine. For thousands of years, Arctic artisans have transformed walrus tusks into tools of survival, such as harpoon heads, snow goggles, and sled runners. Yet, They also saw in the ivory a medium for storytelling. The practice of scrimshaw and fine carving allowed for the preservation of history and myth, with intricate scenes of hunts, spirits, and celestial events etched into the polished surface. This tradition was not merely decorative. It was a way of honoring the spirit of the walrus, ensuring that the animal's sacrifice would be remembered and that its soul would return to the sea to be reborn. These carvings often featured transformations, showing humans with walrus features or vice versa, reinforcing the belief that all life is interconnected through a shared essence. The value of walrus ivory, however, extended far beyond the Arctic Circle, reaching the royal courts of medieval Europe and the workshops of the Islamic world. During the Middle Ages, when the expansion of the Sahara made African elephant ivory difficult to obtain, walrus ivory is often referred to as whalebone in historical texts, though incorrectly, and became the premier luxury material for the Christian world. It was through the Norse settlements in Greenland that this ivory entered the European market. The Vikings were the primary middlemen in this trade, hunting the Atlantic walrus in the treacherous waters of the North Atlantic to satisfy the demand for religious icons, crucifixes, and gaming pieces. The most famous examples of this trade are the Lewis chessmen, found in the Outer Hebrides of Scotland. These 12th century pieces, carved with incredible detail and expressive faces, are almost entirely made from walrus tusks, standing as a silent testament to the global reach of the walrus during the height of the medieval ivory trade. As the demand for ivory grew, it drove a wave of exploration and exploitation that fundamentally altered the geography of the North. Basques, Dutch, and English mariners pushed deeper into the Arctic, seeking not just the oil of the whale, but the seahorses, as they often called the walrus. This commercial hunting was far removed from the sustainable practices of the indigenous peoples. It was an extraction of wealth that saw entire colonies of walruses wiped out in a single season. On islands like Bear Island and the Svalbard archipelago, the remains of these massive slaughters can still be seen in the form of bleached bone piles that have rested for centuries. This historical pressure decimated the Atlantic populations, pushing them to the brink of extinction and leaving a genetic bottleneck that scientists are still studying today to understand the resilience of the surviving herds. The artistic techniques used to work this ivory are as specialized as the animal itself. Unlike elephant ivory, which has a consistent structure, a walrus tusk has a core of secondary dentine that has a marbled, crystalline appearance. When an artist carves deep into the tooth, this inner texture is revealed, creating a multi-layered visual effect that is unique to the species. To achieve the high-gloss finish seen in prestige artifacts, the ivory must be polished with increasingly fine abrasives, often using shark skin or fine silt in ancient times. In the practice of scrimshaw, the artist uses a sharp needle or knife to scratch a design into the surface, then rubs a pigment, which is traditionally soot, tobacco juice, or lampblack, into the lines to make the image pop. This meticulous process requires a steady hand and an intimate knowledge of the ivory's grain, a skill set that has been passed down through generations of Arctic carvers and is still practiced today as a vital form of cultural expression and economic independence. The walrus also plays a critical role in the maintenance of the seafloor's physical structure, a task it performs with its powerful fins and tusks. As they move across the bottom, they do not merely pick up food. They plow the sediment. This bioturbation is essential for the health of the Arctic shelf. By stirring up the bottom, they prevent the seafloor from becoming anoxic or depleted of oxygen. They redistribute organic matter, making it accessible to smaller scavengers like amphipods and brittle stars, which in turn feed the larger fish and bird populations. In this sense, the walrus is a keystone species. The health of the entire benthic community is tied to the constant rhythmic disturbance caused by the foraging herds. Without the walrus, the Arctic seafloor would be a much quieter, less productive place, lacking the nutrient cycling that supports the massive blooms of life that occur every spring. To understand the walrus is to understand the mastery of oxygen. When a walrus leaves the surface, it enters a realm where pressure increases by 1 atmosphere every 10 meters, and the life-sustaining air in its lungs becomes a liability. To survive, the walrus relies on a physiological internal architecture that is nothing short of miraculous. Their blood volume is significantly higher than that of terrestrial mammals of similar size, and it is saturated with high concentrations of hemoglobin. More importantly, their muscle tissue is packed with myoglobin, a protein that stores oxygen directly within the muscle fiber. This allows the walrus to shut down peripheral circulation during a dive, diverting the oxygen-rich blood solely to the heart and brain, while the muscles breathe from their internal stores. This metabolic sorcery allows them to remain submerged for nearly 30 minutes, performing heavy labor on the seafloor in temperatures that would freeze human blood in seconds. The resilience of the walrus is also written in its Master of the Walrus folklore, a complex spiritual framework found across the Bering Strait. In these traditions, the walrus is not a passive victim of the hunt, but a guest who chooses to give itself to a worthy hunter. The master or mother of the walrus is often associated with the deity Sedna in some regions, and observes the conduct of humans. If a hunter is greedy, wasteful, or disrespectful to the carcass, the master will withhold the herds, leading to famine. This belief system created an ancient form of wildlife management. By making the hunt a moral act, indigenous societies ensured they never took more than the ecosystem could replenish. The ritual return of the walrus's skull to the sea was a physical manifestation of the belief in the circularity of time and life, a concept that stands in stark contrast to the linear, extractive philosophy of the modern industrial age. Today, that ancient circularity is being shattered by the disappearance of the sea ice. For the Pacific walrus, the pack ice is not just a platform. It is a moving sidewalk that carries them over the rich clam beds of the Chukchi Sea. As the ice retreats further north into deeper waters where the walruses cannot reach the bottom, the animals are forced onto land. These mega sites, often containing over 30,000 individuals, are powder kegs of stress. On the ice, mothers and calves are spread out. On land, they are packed together. The slightest disturbance, like a low-flying plane, a passing ship, or even the scent of a predator, can trigger a stampede. In these panicked rushes toward the water, the smallest and most vulnerable members of the herd, the calves, are often crushed under the weight of the fleeing adults. This terrestrialization of the walrus is one of the most visible and tragic indicators of a changing climate. Furthermore, the melting of the Arctic has opened the Northwest Passage to a level of industrial shipping and seismic exploration never before seen. An animal that lives in a world of sound is now subjected to the relentless thrum of container ships and the high decibel blasts of air guns used in oil and gas prospecting. This acoustic pollution can mask the lecking songs of the males, disrupt the vital contact calls between mothers and their lost calves, and drive herds away from their primary feeding grounds. The walrus is caught in a pincer movement. Their physical habitat is melting from above, and their sensory habitat is being drowned out from below. The chemistry of the ocean itself is also changing. As the sea absorbs more carbon dioxide, it becomes more acidic, a process that directly threatens the walrus' primary food source. The bivalves and gastropods, or clams and snails, that make up the bulk of their diet struggle to build their calcium carbonate shells in acidic water. If the shell builders fail, the walrus fails. We are witnessing a potential trophic cascade, where the disappearance of microscopic organisms at the base of the food chain eventually starves the 3,000-pound giant at the top. It is a reminder that the walrus is not an isolated curiosity of nature, but a sentinel for the health of the entire planet. In the face of these challenges, there is a burgeoning movement of co-management, where indigenous hunters and Western scientists work together to monitor the herds. Using a combination of satellite telemetry and traditional ecological knowledge, they are mapping the shifting migration routes and identifying quiet zones where shipping can be restricted during sensitive breeding seasons. These collaborations represent a new way of seeing the Arctic, not as a frontier to be conquered, but as a complex living system that requires humility and restraint. To look into the eye of a walrus is to look back through eons of evolutionary history. It is to see a creature that survived the end of the last ice age, that provided the literal and spiritual foundation for human civilization in the north, and that continues to play the role of the great architect of the seafloor. The tusks of the walrus, once the gold of the north, are now symbols of a fragile endurance. Whether they continue to strike their underwater bells in the deep silence of the Arctic, or become mere artifacts in a museum, depends entirely on our ability to recognize that their fate is, and always has been, inextricably linked to our own. The walrus is the witness. The question is whether we are willing to hear what it has to say. Thank you and good night.